How much will this week's joint practices and preseason game against the Miami Dolphins help decide the outcome of 5 key camp battles for the Atlanta Falcons?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the summer chugs along, the sports aren't always sporting like we want them to, but this summer FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble hater, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And of course, been covering the Falcons for, almost 2 decades. Formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong in this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. All of you that make this illustrious pod your first listen, your first watch each and every day. And if you want to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are previewing the upcoming joint practices for the Falcons against the Miami Dolphins on Tuesday and Wednesday. If I'm not mistaken, the Falcons are probably either just landing or in the air currently or about to get on the plane to fly down to Miami. And we'll focus on sort of the 5 main position battles that we talked about at the beginning of camp that we will sort of be monitoring throughout the camp process. And we've touched upon these so far and sort of last week talked about how things were trending after the first week of practices. And now it'll be time to give them an update and how things might trend over the next week, because this is going to be, a big week for the evaluation of that. And if you don't know what 5 positions I'm talking about slot receiver, I'm talking about nose tackle, I'm talking about weak side linebacker, outside corner, and strong safety, right? Now, what's been interesting through 8-9 days of practice and 12 days since the Falcons reported is 3 of those position battles really haven't been battles all that much. That's been the slot receiver role. That's been the starting outside cornerback, and that's been the starting strong safety, because it seems like at least up to this point, it's clearly one guy starting at each of those spots, at least getting the vast majority of the starting reps, if not all of the starting reps. At slot receiver, that's Ray McLeod over Rondale Moore. That's Mike Hughes over Clark Phillips at the cornerback position, and Richie Grant over DeMarco Helms at that strong safety position. And we'll see if, Moore and Phillips and Helms can kind of make up ground during this week of joint practices. But to be honest with you, I'm not really expecting a lot of movement until we get to Friday night and when the Falcons are playing the Dolphins on the football field. It wouldn't shock me if the guys that we're calling the presumptive starters at those 3 spots, and Ray McLeod, Mike Hughes, and Richie Grant, don't play on Friday night in the preseason game. I would be surprised if, Rondale Moore, Clark Phillips, and DeMarco Helms didn't play on Friday night. So I think that gives those guys potentially some opportunity to make up some ground on that competition, and potentially these be more compelling competitions than they seem to be up to this point, a little bit more front and center next week when we head into the week 2 preseason game against the Baltimore Ravens. And then when you look at the other 2 positions, nose tackle and weak side linebacker, those do seem to be more legit competitions. At nose tackle, Eddie Goldman has been picking up a lot of steam. Several practice observations have been praising him as of late over the second week of training camp. That's good for him. His biggest challenger presumably is LaCale London, and we'll see if LaCale London can get back into the mix. This nose tackle spot, even though it's technically a starter because they're going to be starting in the base defense, that you're not expecting this guy to get a huge amount of snaps, right? They'll play in the base defense. That'll be 20, 25% of the snaps roughly or so. But it's really part of the process of keeping guys like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata fresh, which we discussed on yesterday's episode alongside several of those rookies. Now, at weak side linebacker, this one to me has been the most compelling of the 5 so far, right? Because it does seem like there's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of rotation between Nate Landman and Troy Andersen at that starting weak side linebacker spot next to Kay Nellis, who is the presumptive starter, the incumbent starter at that Mike linebacker spot. Both Landman and Andersen have gotten a ton of first team reps, right? And it's led to a lot of speculation from many folks that we will see, all 3 of these guys line up on the field. So we'll have 3 starting inside linebackers, so to speak, as opposed to 2 that you typically see. I tend to be a little bit more skeptical on how much a 3 linebacker package is going to be featured this year. I think there will be a package for it, but I think it's going to be a very small part of the defense. But I think this week especially is a great opportunity for someone like Troy Andersen going up against Miami specifically, because we know Miami has a ton of speed at the skill positions, including the running back position, where you could probably, if you made a list of the 15 fastest or at least the 15 most explosive running backs in the NFL, it wouldn't shock me if 4 of the Dolphins running backs would be on that list in Raheem Mostert, Devin Achane, Jalen Wright, and Jeff Wilson. And having an athlete like Troy Andersen that can cover a lot of ground and run with some of these guys, all of those guys run in the 4.3s, right? Troy Andersen runs in the 4.4s. And that's the value of what Troy Andersen brings. And you've heard me talk about that a bunch over this offseason, throughout this summer. That's what we talk about with the upside of Troy Andersen. He allows you to match up in games like this where you don't want to have someone like Nate Landman, who is a very good player at what he does well, but what he does well does not really match up with what the Dolphins are doing, where their entire offense is built around speed, and Nate Landman with his 4.8, 640 is going to be a mismatch trying to run with these 4.3 guys, and especially the 4.2 guys that they have at the wide receiver position, where you're dropping into space and trying to cover ground and whatnot. And so, Landman, certainly there are certain matchups that we'll see this season where Landman's going to be extremely valuable, probably that week 1 matchup against Pittsburgh, right? Where, given Arthur Smith's tendencies of wanting to be that physical run team, maybe later in the season when we play the Chargers, given Jim Harbaugh's sort of similar proclivities with that Chargers offense, those are 2 games where, I want Nate Landman out there to do what he does as that downhill run thumping player against teams that are going to probably feature a lot of 2 tight ends, fullback sets, all those various things. But most of the other games this season, I want to have the speed on the field. But, that's where the Troy Andersen concerns come from. We've seen only limited opportunities for him on the field. Of course, last year he missed most of the season with a torn pectoral injury. Flashed some ability there, but we need to see Troy Andersen put it together. That's what you hear Jarvis constantly talk about. Jarvis acknowledges the upside and the talent and the athleticism and all these various things, but you got to make plays on the field. We've seen Nate Landman do that. We haven't quite had that opportunity to see Troy Andersen do that, and that's the big question with Troy Andersen. But this, to me, is a great week to showcase that playmaking ability that Troy Andersen potentially has going up against this Dolphins team, where he's kind of the perfect little, maybe not the perfect, but the ideal sort of chess piece to have at that linebacker position to deal with all the speed and all the motion that the Dolphins will do. So, I think of the 5 spots, the linebacker position is probably the one that could get the most movement, where if Troy Andersen has a good week of practice, we can really be saying yep, that's Troy Andersen's job to lose outside of, those 2 games where, Nate Landman should start those games, as I mentioned before. So that to me is of these 5, that's the one that I have circled where I think you could get some real movement this week, especially in the joint practices against the Dolphins. But speaking of movement, let's talk about whether or not we're going to see later this week, when we get to Friday night, where they're going to see any of these starters in the preseason action against the Dolphins. And that's what we'll get into as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, it is summertime, and sports, calendar isn't great in the summer, but things are heating up. Olympics are still going strong. We've got about a little more of a week left. And by the time Olympics ends, football preseason will be in full swing. And of course, we're only months away from NBA and NHL, being around the corner. And if you're, wanting the sports to come back, FanDuel's a great place to go, because they're going to hook up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just head over to FanDuel.com and you can make the most of it this summer. And if you still want to get in on that MLB action, put some money down on the Braves to, usurp the Phillies in the National League in their division, all that stuff. It's all available for you at FanDuel if you want to put, money on the upcoming odds for the NFL season, or, you want to, take advantage of this last week of, the breakdancing. I know FanDuel has, odds on the breakdancing final. So, find your favorite B boy or B girl out there across the globe and put some money on them by heading over to FanDuel.com. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So I'm not expecting that we're going to see really any of the Falcons starters play on Friday night against the Dolphins. Pretty much nobody on offense, I think, is going to play, and probably some key backups like Tyler Algier probably aren't going to play. All of those guys are seemingly entrenched. I think some key veterans on the defense we probably won't see. Guys like Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Caden Ellis, AJ Terrell, Jesse Bates. I would be surprised if they play on Friday. We talked about this all summer long with Raheem Morris coming to town and being one of the Sean McVay disciples. And we noted how McVay and several of his disciples like Zach Taylor in Cincinnati or Kevin O'Connell in Minnesota don't play their starters during the preseason. We're assuming that Raheem Morris is going to follow suit on that. The general vibe so far seems to suggest that he will sort of be a prototypical McVay disciple and not play his starters this preseason. But, we'll see on that end. But if you want to, get the lowdown on what's going to happen in your upcoming fantasy drafts, why not check out Locked On Fantasy Football as your second listen after today's first listen here on Locked On Falcons. Locked On Fantasy Football is part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. But I think it's going to be interesting to see that if we are going to see any of the starters play on Friday night, it would probably be at several of these competition spots like corner, like slot receiver, like strong safety, right? Will Mike Hughes play? Will Ray-Ray McCloud and Richie Grant play? Right. Again, as I said earlier, I'm very confident, that Clark Phillips, Rondale Moore, and DeMarco Hellams will play on Friday night. But will the guys that are seemingly keeping them at bay, keeping them working primarily with the second team unit, also play? And to me, it'll also say a lot if we don't see guys like Mike Hughes and Ray-Ray McCloud and Richie Grant not playing, because it would basically say that they are part of that entrenched group of starters. And that would tell you a lot about the competitions and how those things are going. And it's like, oh, maybe this isn't a competition as much as we thought it was going into training camp. Now, I say that I'm not going to read too much into that, at least this week, when it comes to guys not playing, just because we have the sort of relatively unique situation of the joint practices, which a lot of teams treat as basically a rehearsal for a preseason game. And it's like, oh, well, we don't have to play in the preseason because we just did 2 days of practices against another team and in padded practices and all that stuff, So we'll see on that front. But to me, it would be more telling, I guess, sitting here today, if these guys didn't also play again next week against Baltimore, right? Because if we are going to see any of these starters play, it seems like it's more likely to be against the Ravens in 12 days than it will be this week against the Dolphins. And that tends to fit with the league-wide trends. Again, some teams treat most teams tend to treat the second or third preseason game as this quote-unquote dress rehearsal game. Back in the days when it was 4 preseason games, it was typically that third preseason game that was a dress rehearsal game, which was the one where you would play your starters and simulate a regular season game. But, looking at the data, looking at last summer, and looking at, when certain quarterbacks and left tackles, just sort of looking at those two sort of key entrenched positions, it seems like there's slightly higher rates around the league of second games being used as the dress rehearsal game than the third game, but the third game is a close second. So it's kind of a toss-up. But I say all that just because I'm thinking, if Raheem Morris follows the conventional wisdom says he might play his starters against Baltimore, not necessarily in that final week against Jacksonville, but we'll see how that goes. But again, that's part of the conversation about these position battles where, if you're evaluating a competition, the preseason games are a part of that evaluation, right? And if you don't see guys in the preseason, maybe that means that the team isn't really that interested in evaluating because there isn't a competition, basically is what I'm saying. So to reiterate that point, I'm not confident that we're going to see any of the quote unquote starters at the cornerback position, at strong safety, at weak side, at the slot receiver, play on Friday night. I'm much more optimistic that we will see the guys in the competition at nose tackle and linebacker starting and playing on Friday night, right? I'm assuming Eddie Goldman, LaCale London, Troy Andersen, and Nate Landman are going to play on Friday. We'll see about Ray McLeod. We'll see about Richie Grant. We'll see about Mike Hughes. But again, Clark Phillips, Rondale Moore, DeMarco Hellams, I fully expect those guys to play on Friday night. So that will be interesting conversation to have at the end of this week. But, because we might not see some of these guys play on Friday, it does make, Tuesday and Wednesday with the joint practices a lot more meaningful in that evaluation. And that's where I want to get into as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, sort of what are some of the key battles that we're going to see against Miami, that we're going to see this Falcons team, offense, defense, match up against Miami, that is going to tell us a lot more, not only about some of these key position battles, but about this football team moving forward. And we'll break those down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. And guys, what are your self-care non-negotiables? When your schedule is packed with like kids' activities, big projects at work, and so much more, it's easy for your priorities to slip, and it's hard to make time for things, even things that we know make us happy. And that's when you feel like you don't have time for yourself. Non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Therapy has taught me positive coping skills, like you can only control what you can control. It's a coping skill I deal with every Sunday when watching the Atlanta Falcons. And if you're thinking of starting therapy for whatever reason that you need help with to, maximize what is important in your life and deal with coping skills and all that stuff, I cannot recommend enough to give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's convenient, flexible, suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and you can get matched with a licensed therapist in days. And then you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. It's a lot easier to find that right match for a therapist with BetterHelp that you can do with traditional offline therapy. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp by visiting BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons, want to let you guys know, why not check out Locked On Dolphins to get Kyle Krabs, the host of Locked On Dolphins, thoughts on the matchups against the Falcons from the Dolphins' perspective. I know he dropped an episode on Monday talking about that. And obviously, if you're trying to get the complete angle of the next 2 days of joint practices, subscribing to Locked On Dolphins, part of Locked On Podcast Network, on your favorite podcast platform or YouTube would be, smart decision on your part to get you get one half of it from me, you'll get the other half from Kyle. So go check that out if you can. But I think there are some key matchups in these joint practices where we should get to see all the starters, right? As I suggested before, Friday is more of a toss-up, but Tuesday and Wednesday, we'll see these guys out there in those joint practices, right? Even the entrenched guys. And I think there are some marquee matchups, right? Probably the marquee matchup is going to be the Dolphins' overall skill position players versus the Falcons' defense. And obviously, probably of that, marquee of the marquee is the Dolphins wide receivers against the Falcons corners, right? Where we're just trying to evaluate. And that's Jalen Waddle, that's Tyreek Hill. Will both Waddle and Hill practice on Tuesday, Wednesday? Again, probably, but, Hill does get some veteran rest days. Waddle does take the occasional day off as well. Odell Beckham Jr., who is the Dolphins' number 3 wide receiver. Good grief. He's on the PUP list, so he won't probably, unless he gets cleared in the next, 24 to 48 hours, but he won't be practicing. So we'll probably see both Hill and Waddle, but there's a chance. They might sit them, and hopefully, if Mike McDaniel, if you're watching, why not give Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle a rest day? Like, they don't really need the work. We know what they're the best duo of wide receivers in the NFL. Like, we don't need to see them go up against the Falcons secondary. Like, no one needs to see that, right? No one needs to see Falcons corners getting torched, to cause a slight panic amongst the fan base, like we saw last year when Tyreek Hill did some things to Trey Flowers in that joint practice last year. Like, we don't need to see that again. Like, you made your point, Mike. That's all I'm saying. So I want to see Braxton Berrios, Malik Washington, Willie Snead, right? Our old friend Willie Snead, get those practice reps. That's going to be a lot more valuable as an evaluation tool for you, Mike, as well as for the Atlanta Falcons. That's all I'm saying. So, let our corners build a little bit of confidence. Just help a brother out. That's all I'm saying, Mike. So, Raheem and you go way back. So just do the brother a solid, is what I'm asking for you, Mike. But, we'll see if that falls on deaf ears. But, as I mentioned before, it's not just the speed that the Dolphins have at wide receiver. It's the speed at the running back position. Reiterating my point earlier that, you want to have Troy Andersen and see what his speed brings to the table. If he can help, neutralize is a strong word for practice, but you know what I'm saying, like help neutralize the speedy Dolphins running backs. And I think it'll also be a good litmus test for Nate Landman and JD Bertrand, right? We know Nate Landman is not as athletically gifted as the other linebackers the Falcons have, but this will be a good test for him to see if that's truly a limitation, like I tend to think it is, or is that a figment of my imagination, as well as JD Bertrand, right? Where we talked about with JD Bertrand, who we thought was athletic enough for the NFL, and I think Miami's athleticism is definitely going to test whether or not that statement is true. So on that same side of the ball, the Falcons defensive front going up against the Dolphins offensive line, in joint practices, you want to see the Falcons starters being disruptive throughout the day in practice and hearing, from Dolphins beat writers and whatnot saying like, yeah, they couldn't block Grady Jarrett. They couldn't block David Onyemata. They couldn't block insert other name here, right? You go look at a player like Arnold Ebiketie, where, he had a dominant preseason game against the Dolphins last year after the joint practices going up against their backup offensive line. You want to see these rookies kind of dominate those backups and offensive linemen for the Dolphins, throughout the week and then later on Friday, right? Which one of these rookies is going to go off? Is it going to be Rook? Is it going to be Brandon Douglas? Is it going to be Zach Harrison, Braylon Trice, whoever it is? Is it going to be D'Angelo Malone, who's kind of on bubble watch? We talked about that at the beginning of camp, that he was one of several bubble players that we talked about that wasn't, assured a roster spot. This has been a ongoing topic of conversation in the Locked On Falcons Discord. If you want to join, link in the description below, talking about D'Angelo Malone and what his status is, and is he on the outside looking in, or is all those various things. But it's notable to me that I've seen 2 53-man roster projections over the weekend from Joe Patrick and Daniel Flick, who have been at pretty much every practice as far as I'm aware of so far in training camp. And both of those guys left D'Angelo Malone off of their 53-man roster, put him on the practice squad, but they had guys like Damon Harris, making the roster over D'Angelo Malone. So that will be something worth noting to see how these guys fare over the course of this week against Miami, where they should, at least theoretically, have an opportunity to feast on a subpar backup Dolphins offensive line, at least based off of what we saw last year, where they did feast on those guys, especially in that preseason game. So that will be certainly big for D'Angelo Malone to sort of say, not so fast, my friend. Don't write me off just yet. So Friday, I think, this week and Friday is also going to be a big week for D'Angelo Malone. But the other last key matchup I do want to talk about is Kyle Pitts versus everyone. I know Kyle Krabs on Locked On Dolphins noted this in his breakdown, previewing some of the key matchups, that Miami doesn't really have somebody that matches up well with Kyle Pitts, right? And that's going to be one of the things, like who does the best against Kyle Pitts is going to be something that he's going to be keyed on. And, that's going to be interesting from the Falcons perspective. It's like, yeah, who watching Kyle out here doing his thing, Kyle Pitts, that is, doing his thing. And like, if I'm, Anthony Weaver, the Dolphins DC, if I'm looking at my roster and I'm like, okay, if we're playing a game against the Falcons, who am I going to put on Kyle Pitts? Probably Jalen Ramsey's probably the best option to do that in terms of like having the size and speed and athleticism to be that matchup guy. But, that would be my strategy in an actual game. But obviously we're not going to play an actual game. It's going to be joint practices. And so I expect Pitts to kind of feast on Tuesday and Wednesday in these joint practices for that very reason, because I don't know how many times it's going to be him versus Jalen Ramsey, in team drills and 7-on-7 in 1-on-1s, should they do those. So that will be something to keep an eye on. So I'm looking forward to see if Kyle Pitts can sort of dominate. And this is something we've touched upon briefly on the podcast in the past. and we'll probably explore in depth in the coming weeks. But, we've talked a little bit about Kyle Pitts being the sort of mismatch creator for this Falcons offense and being that sort of big factor in creating problems. And this is what, when Arthur Smith was saying this in those weeks where people were complaining about him not getting Kyle Pitts the ball, I know a lot of people, ignored Arthur Smith's comments, but he was right? That like Kyle Pitts impacts this offense in ways that go beyond the stat sheet. But of course, only people care about the stat sheet because, fantasy and all that stuff. But, we talked about this briefly in the podcast, but like I'm in my head sort of thinking about it as like 11 and a half personnel, right? It's not true 11 personnel, 3 wide receivers. It's not 12 personnel, 2 tight ends. It's 11 and a half personnel when you have Kyle Pitts out there as in technically 12 personnel, but because Kyle Pitts is kind of this hybrid unicorn player, it's kind of 11 and a half personnel is how I'm thinking. And you have Charlie Warner as the sort of inline tight end. You have Kyle Pitts flexed out, basically functioning as a slot receiver in that 11 and a half personnel that we're talking about. And to me, the ways that I'm envisioning Zach Robinson using this to create mismatches is, sort of figuring out how defenses are going to try to defend this 11 and a half personnel, because traditionally teams, when they see 2 tight ends on the field, they tend to defend it with base personnel, which means, you get a linebacker potentially locked up on Kyle Pitts or a safety on him. And that's the thing about Kyle Pitts. That's why we call him the unicorn, right? He's too fast for a linebacker. He's too big for a safety. And in those situations, if defenses do say we're going to play base against the Falcons 11 and a half personnel, then that gives Zach Robinson carte blanche to just, throw the football, because he's going to have those sort of mismatches with Kyle Pitts and whatever you are dealing with Darnell Mooney and Drake London on the outside, along with Bijan Robinson coming out of the backfield. And, Charlie Warner can do whatever Charlie Warner needs to do. That's why. But, I'm not expecting Charlie Warner to be a featured option in those situations. But that's where the Falcons can really, really spam their, play action passing game and get these one-on-ones against Kyle Pitts in these mismatches. But if defenses decide to play it with nickel and they're like, we're going to treat Kyle Pitts like he's a true slot receiver, and we're going to put a nickel cornerback out there, well, now Zach Robinson can counter by basically saying we're going to run the ball down your throat, because we're going to have a mismatch on the outside where Kyle Pitts is going to be that impactful blocker. We can talk about, hey, maybe Kyle Pitts isn't the world's greatest blocker as an inline tight end that you want matched up against, defensive ends and whatnot. But against a nickel cornerback, sure, like Kyle Pitts should be able to dominate that matchup as a run blocker. And so if defenses want to play nickel against that 11 and a half personnel, then we'll just run it down your throat. And that's sort of the balance. I think that's kind of the chess match. And that's why Kyle Pitts can be a very impactful player when it comes to mismatches, even if in those games he's not necessarily getting, all the targets and whatnot in those games, only having 3 or 4 catches in those games, but he can, at least in the ones where we're running the football. But that's where he is able to dictate matchups. And that's one of the values that Kyle Pitts, I think, potentially could have in this offense. And we'll see if we see that in the regular season. Again, I don't think that's something that we're going to see in these upcoming joint practices too much, because I think, Zach Robinson is going to kind of hold his cards close to the vest, close to the chest, however you want to say that idiom, moving forward. So I probably won't see this a ton during the week or at any point in August, but come September, come October, etc., I do think that will be a certain X factor for this Falcons offense moving forward. So that is something, I want to see. But in the meantime, I just kind of want to see Kyle Pitts, Moss and dudes. That's all I really need to see from him this week. So we'll see if that is the case tomorrow. We should have a guest that will be on hand in Miami to check out these joint practices. That will be Daniel Flick of Fan Nation over at Sports Illustrated. And we'll pick Daniel's brain on what he sees in the practices, and maybe we'll get some insight into, why he had the audacity to leave D'Angelo Malone off of his 53-man roster projection. I know at least 2 people in the Locked On Falcons Discord that want answers on that one. So if you want answers on that and any other issues, by all means, make Locked On Falcons your first listen tomorrow. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Check out Locked On Fantasy Football, as well as Locked On Dolphins. And of course, we got an entire family of shows here on Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every